They say the sky over Europe in 1944 was no place for the faint-hearted. Every flight meant a gamble between life and death, a spinning coin tossed into the clouds. And on one such day, a lone German pilot flying a battered Focke-Wulf 190 would find himself trapped in the jaws of 12 Allied fighters, outnumbered, outgunned, hunted, yet somehow, against all logic, he would vanish, disappearing into the mist like a ghost. His escape would go down as one of the most incredible acts of aerial survival in the Second World War, a story whispered by pilots on both sides of the front line. To understand how that day unfolded, we need to go back to the machine, the man, and the war-torn skies that made miracles possible. By 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of the force it had once been. The early war years, when German pilots ruled the sky, were over. Allied air power, especially from the Royal Air Force and the U.S. Army Air Forces, had grown overwhelming. The Americans were flying thousands of B-17s and B-24s deep into the Reich, escorted by swarms of long-range P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts. German cities burned under daylight raids, and the Luftwaffe fought desperately to stop them. Every mission for a German pilot was a high-stakes fight against time and numbers. Fuel shortages, inexperienced wingmen and mechanical breakdowns haunted their squadrons. Against that backdrop, one aircraft stood as a symbol of German engineering brilliance and brute survival instinct: the Focke-Wulf 190. The FW-190, nicknamed Werger, or Butcher Bird, was a pride of the Luftwaffe. It was fast, rugged, and deadly. Pilots loved it for its wide wings, powerful BMW radial engine, and heavy armament. Two 13mm machine guns in the nose, and four 20mm cannons in the wings. It could dive like a hawk and roll faster than most Allied fighters. American pilots learned early. If you saw the Butcher Bird in your sights, you needed to tread carefully. But by mid-1944, the FW-190 faced new challenges. The Allies were improving their tactics, using coordinated formations and radio calls to corner isolated enemies. In the face of overwhelming odds, Luftwaffe pilots often relied on instinct, cunning, and the environment itself, using clouds, terrain, and sheer daring to survive. And this is where our story begins. Over northern France, late summer, just weeks after the D-Day invasion, the Allies had established a strong foothold in Normandy and were pushing inland. The skies were alive with activity. Allied bombers targeted supply routes in German armor, while Luftwaffe squadrons scrambled to defend what little they could. In one of those units, a veteran pilot whose name, like many Luftwaffe aces, was lost in the fog of history, took off in his FW-190 for a routine patrol mission. His orders: intercept Allied fighter bombers harassing German convoys retreating east. What began as a simple sortie would turn into a desperate fight for survival. He climbed to altitude, cutting through thick layers of white cumulus clouds. The sun burned high over the channel, and the contrails of countless aircraft marked the sky like scars. Radio chatter filled his ears, scattered, panicked voices of comrades under attack. He adjusted his trim, checked his six, and pressed forward into the unknown. Minutes later, he spotted them, silver shapes glinting in the sunlight. 12 Allied fighters in formation, American Mustangs, sleek and fast, their drop tanks still attached. He was alone. They had the numbers, and they saw him first. Within seconds, the air around him erupted with tracer fire. The sky turned into a death trap. His warning light blinked red. Bullets tore through his fuselage, and his right wing took damage. He yanked the stick, rolled hard, and dove, the world spinning into a blur of sky and earth. Most pilots would have tried to run for home, but there was nowhere to go. He was deep in enemy territory, low on fuel, and badly outnumbered. 12 Mustangs were closing in, hungry for the kill. Yet instead of fleeing in a straight line, the instinct of every pilot under fire, he did something insane, something no one expected. He turned toward the clouds. The massive storm front ahead loomed dark and thick, a swirling wall of vapor rising from the French coast. Visibility inside would be almost zero. Most pilots avoided such clouds. They had turbulence, hail, even lightning. To enter was to fly blind, to risk losing control, to crash without warning. But this man knew that inside chaos lay his only chance. He throttled back slightly, cut into the formation's blind spot, and dove straight into the storm. Behind him, the Mustangs followed, one after another, but soon realized their radar and visual contact was gone. Inside that storm, instruments lied, wings iced over, and sound itself was drowned in the thunder. Somewhere in that swirling chaos of vapor and lightning, the German ace was weaving through death itself, using the storm as his ally. But what happened inside those clouds, and how he emerged on the other side alive, would baffle even experienced pilots. Because when the storm cleared, the FW-190 was gone. The 12 Allied pilots regrouped, scanning the horizon. Nothing. No wreckage, no smoke, no parachute. The butcher bird had simply vanished. For years, the story circulated in briefing rooms and airfields across Europe. A mysterious encounter in which a lone German fighter had evaded a full squadron using nothing but the weather and terrain. Some called it luck. Others said it was genius. But the truth, as we'll uncover, was far stranger. What that pilot did inside those clouds wasn't just instinct. It was a result of deep understanding of both his machine and the landscape below. He used the clouds like a cloak and the terrain like a trap. This was not just survival. It was art. And as the Allied pilots searched in vain above, somewhere below the mist, the FW-190 pilot was skimming treetops, engines sputtering, using valleys, rivers, and shadow to melt back into the countryside. But how exactly did he pull off the impossible? And what hidden maneuvers did he use to fool a dozen of the best-trained Allied aviators in the world? In the next part, we'll dive deep into the aerial chess match that unfolded that day, the tricks, the misdirection, and the split-second decisions that turned certain death into one of the most legendary escapes of the war. The Allied squadron flying above the French countryside had just witnessed something they couldn't explain. A German FW-190 had plunged into a storm that no sane pilot would dare enter, and then vanished without a trace. For the next 30 minutes, they combed the area, circling, calling out positions over the radio. No answer, no visual. It was as if the storm itself had swallowed the enemy whole. But down below, deep within the rolling clouds, that same pilot was fighting for his life and his control stick. His cockpit canopy rattled as turbulence slammed into the wings, throwing the plane from side to side. Lightning flashed across his nose, the instruments flickering under static interference. The artificial horizon spun wildly. The altimeter was useless. He was blind, and yet he wasn't panicking. This man had seen enough combat to understand that in the sky, panic kills faster than bullets. He gripped the stick lightly, feeling the air pressure against his wings, trusting the sensations in his fingertips more than the broken needles on his dashboard. He remembered his training. When instruments fail, fly the plane by touch, by balance, by instinct. What he did next was a calculated gamble, the kind only a pilot who truly knew his machine could make. He throttled down the engine, dropped his nose slightly, and descended into the storm, losing altitude fast. The roar of the wind grew deafening as the FW-190 sliced through layers of cloud. He wanted to disappear completely, not just from sight, but from radar and radio. The Allies, by then, were beginning to rely on primitive early warning radar systems to track enemy aircraft. But those systems had blind spots, especially near the ground or within heavy weather. The German ace knew that if he could drop low enough, the terrain itself would shield him. France's rolling hills and forests would hide his radar signature, and the valleys would muffle the sound of his engine. He burst out of the cloud layer barely a few hundred meters above the ground. Rain pelting the canopy, the countryside rushing beneath him in a blur. For a split second, he caught sight of his own reflection in the glass. Sweat running down his temple, his eyes steady. Above him, the storm howled like a living thing, masking him from the hunters circling in the sunlit sky beyond. But the danger wasn't over. Flying low came with its own deadly risks. One wrong move, one misjudged turn, and he would slam into the ground at over 400 kilometers per hour. And the Mustangs weren't far behind. They were spreading out, some diving toward the storm's edge, trying to flush him out. So he improvised. Instead of flying straight toward home, he followed the contours of the land, a twisting pattern that mirrored the natural rise and fall of the French countryside. He hugged the terrain so closely that his wingtips nearly brushed the treetops. To any Allied radar operator watching from a distance, his signal would vanish, blending into the background clutter. He passed over a river valley, banking sharply to follow its curve. The FW-190's powerful engine groaned under the stress, but the aircraft held steady. The German pilot had discovered one of the most effective, yet least understood, defensive maneuvers of the late war: terrain masking. This was a trick learned by only the most experienced Luftwaffe veterans. By using the Earth's surface, hills, rivers, forests, as natural cover, they could fly unseen beneath enemy radar sweeps. It was a technique that would later inspire Cold War jet tactics, decades ahead of its time. Meanwhile, above the clouds, the Allied pilots debated their options. The squadron leader, a seasoned American ace, was skeptical. "He's gone," he muttered through the radio. "Either he crashed or he's hiding in that soup." Another voice crackled back. "He can't have vanished. There's no way." But the leader knew better. He'd faced the FW-190s before. They were fast, but more than that, the pilots flying them were cunning. In the years after the war, many Allied airmen admitted grudging respect for their Luftwaffe counterparts. Despite fighting for a doomed cause, these men displayed unmatched skill and creativity in the air. They had to. Outnumbered 10-1, they survived only by outsmarting their enemies. And this pilot, whoever he was, embodied that spirit. At one point, he flew so low that his engine wash kicked up dirt from the field below. French farmers later claimed they saw a German plane flash by just above the trees, a gray blur roaring over rooftops before vanishing into the mist again. They thought it was crashing. It wasn't. It was surviving. For the next 20 minutes, the FW-190 weaved through valleys and rivers, darting between fog banks and using low cloud cover like a shield. He was heading east, toward the German lines, but he never flew straight for long. He zigzagged across the terrain, never predictable, always one step ahead. At one point, he spotted his reflection again, not in the glass this time, but in the river below. For a brief second, he realized how close he was flying to death, just meters above the surface, relying entirely on reflex and memory. But that was how the Luftwaffe trained its best: precision, nerve, and control. And behind that calm discipline was something else, something less visible, but even more powerful: desperation. By 1944, the German Air Force was bleeding. Most of its best pilots were dead, captured, or grounded due to fuel shortages. The ones who remained were fighting on instinct. Every battle was personal. They weren't defending Hitler's empire anymore. They were fighting for each other, for survival, for one more sunrise. And that desperation sometimes produced miracles. Historians later studied this encounter to understand how a single plane could vanish from 12 enemy pursuers. What they found was a masterclass in tactical flying, a combination of weather awareness, terrain use, and raw intuition. The pilot's decision to enter the storm wasn't random. He had noticed that the Thunderhead was moving east toward friendly territory. By diving into it, he not only lost his pursuers, but also allowed the wind currents to drift him closer to safety. Even his engine management was deliberate. The FW-190's BMW-801 radial engine could withstand short bursts of overboost, something most Allied fighters couldn't risk without overheating. By toggling the throttle and adjusting prop pitch, he could sprint in bursts, then cool off during glides. This gave him short-range acceleration that surprised enemies who thought he'd been hit or slowing down. Pilots called this the phantom burst technique, appearing fast for moments, then fading like smoke. That's how he stayed invisible, both to radar and to human eyes. By the time the storm cleared completely, the Allied formation had given up the chase. They returned to base, reporting that the German had either crashed or somehow escaped. No one could say for sure. But deep inside occupied France, a lone FW-190 skimmed above the forest, heading for the eastern horizon. Its paint was scorched, its fuselage riddled with holes, and its pilot utterly exhausted. But he was alive, and that, in the sky of 1944, was the only victory that mattered. Still, his story doesn't end there, because what happened next, just miles from safety, would turn this already legendary escape into one of the most daring finales in the annals of aerial combat. The storm was behind him, but the real danger was still ahead. The rain had finally eased. The French countryside stretched out below, soaked and glistening under a bruised gray sky. The FW-190 skimmed above the tree-line, its wings trembling, its engine coughing from the punishment it had endured. The pilot had been flying for nearly 40 minutes without pause, hunted, blinded, and now utterly alone. He should have felt relief, but he didn't, because as the clouds broke and the terrain leveled out, a new sound began to creep into the cockpit. A faint metallic rattle from beneath the nose. It was subtle at first, just a vibration through the rudder pedals. But soon it grew louder, harsher, and then came the smell of smoke. His fuel line had taken a hit during the earlier dogfight. The storm had hidden it, but now it was leaking into the hot engine compartment. He knew what that meant. The FW-190 had enough fuel for maybe 15 minutes, if the engine didn't catch fire first. But he was still miles from friendly territory, and the front line was a shifting, chaotic mess. Allied ground troops were everywhere. The pilot scanned the landscape, desperate for a landmark, a road, anything familiar. Then, through a thin veil of mist, he saw it, a winding forest road leading toward a small village. Beyond that, faint in the distance, a patch of smoke rising in columns, German positions still holding. If he could just make it there. He pushed the throttle forward gently, coaxing every ounce of life from the failing engine. The propeller stuttered but held. The aircraft gained a few hundred feet. He was so close now that he could see the fields and hedgerows below, the patchwork of war-torn France. But fate wasn't done testing him yet. Two dark shapes appeared suddenly on the horizon, glinting silver in the sunlight. Allied fighters, P-47 Thunderbolts, likely on patrol. He counted them quickly. 2. Just 2. But even 2 was enough to finish him. He knew he couldn't outrun them. Not anymore. His engine was dying, his fuel was almost gone, and his aircraft, riddled with holes, could barely hold altitude. Yet, for a man who had already cheated death once that day, surrender was not an option. So he did something that would later be described by witnesses as insane genius. He cut his throttle almost entirely, letting the plane drop into a silent glide. His FW-190 dipped below the tree-line, vanishing from the Thunderbolt's view. The two Allied pilots radioed to each other, scanning the ground, convinced their prey had crashed. They dove lower, searching for smoke. But there was none, because the German pilot wasn't crashing. He was gliding. He used the rolling terrain once more, descending into a shallow valley, following a river bend that curved away from the sunlight. Every second, he adjusted his flaps to keep from stalling. The silence in the cockpit was eerie, only the wind whispering against the canopy. Above him, the P-47s crisscrossed the sky, circling like hawks, but they never saw him. The valley was narrow, shaded by thick trees, and the FW-190, painted in mottled gray-green camouflage, was invisible against the wet forest backdrop. For nearly 5 minutes, he stayed like that, a silent phantom drifting through the valley. Then, as the last drops of rain fell from the clouds, he saw it, a stretch of open field beside a narrow dirt road. It wasn't a runway, not even close, but it would have to do. He lowered his landing gear manually. The hydraulics had failed. One wheel locked, the other hung loose. It didn't matter. This was his only chance. With a deep breath, he leveled the wings and aimed for the field. The FW-190's wheels hit the ground with a violent jolt. The plane bounced once, twice, and then skidded, tearing through wet grass and mud. One wing clipped a fence post and snapped the tip clean off. The propeller bent, sparks flying. But somehow, unbelievably, the aircraft came to rest upright, nose buried in the soil, engine smoking. He sat there for a moment motionless, heart hammering, rain tapping against the canopy. Then, slowly, he unbuckled his harness and pushed the cockpit open. Cold air rushed in. He was alive. The sound of distant gunfire echoed faintly to the east, the front line. He knew he didn't have long. Enemy patrols could be nearby. So he grabbed his map, his sidearm, and a small compass, then ran, leaving the battered FW-190 behind. He disappeared into the forest, melting into the shadows just as he had into the storm. Hours later, he stumbled into a German field outpost, exhausted and soaked, his flight suit torn. When they saw him, the soldiers couldn't believe it. They had heard reports of an FW-190 going down, pursued by Allied fighters. To them, this man walking out of the forest was a ghost. He gave a brief report, calm, matter-of-fact, describing how 12 Allied planes had chased him, how he used a storm to vanish, and how he had landed just short of friendly lines. His comrades listened in stunned silence. When he finished, one mechanic reportedly muttered under his breath, "Der Geist im Sturm," the ghost in the storm. That name stuck. In the weeks that followed, pilots across Luftwaffe airfields whispered the story. Some believed it, others called it exaggerated. But the tale spread, a symbol of defiance, a reminder that even in the darkest days of the war, skill and courage could bend the odds. Historians have debated for decades whether the story was based on a single pilot or a combination of several similar incidents. There were indeed multiple reports of FW-190s disappearing into clouds and reappearing far from where they'd been engaged. The Luftwaffe trained its best men to exploit terrain and weather in ways the Allies rarely anticipated. And yet, the technical precision of this escape, the storm entry, the terrain masking, the glide landing, suggests it may have been one man, a pilot who understood that flying wasn't just about combat. It was about reading the sky itself. The FW-190 remained one of the most respected aircraft of the war, even among its enemies. American test pilots who flew capture models after the war called it an aviator's machine, responsive, balanced, and tough. It was said that in the right hands, it could turn the air itself into an ally. That day, in the summer of 1944, it did exactly that. For that pilot, there would be no medals, no official record of the encounter. His name faded into the archives, perhaps lost with his unit in the final months of the war. But the legend endured, because sometimes history doesn't remember names. It remembers moments, flashes of impossible courage that echo long after the guns fall silent. Somewhere in the skies over Normandy, as the clouds rolled and the sun broke through, a single FW-190 defied 12 pursuers and vanished into a storm. And when the Allied pilots returned to base, one of them reportedly said, shaking his head, he was there, and then he wasn't, like the sky itself took him. Maybe it did. For in that vast theater of war, where men fought not just enemies but the elements themselves, there are stories that don't fit into reports or records. Stories of survival, so improbable they seem almost supernatural. And this was one of them. A lone pilot, a dying machine, and the storm that became his salvation. A ghost in the clouds, gone but never forgotten.